Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wolfman Chronicles. I know I told you that Clay would be back for this week's episode, but it is storming like crazy here, and he's actually stuck on the other side of the mountain. So once again, I'm reading the story this week. Clay will be here tomorrow, though, for the Dan Barry's Daughter story, the story by Max Brand that we read on Sundays. And you'll get to hear him again for next week's episode. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. We are reading Book 6. This is episode 68. We're on Chapter 4, A Hidden Agenda, Werewolves in Ireland. And this story takes place on Achill Island. The fire crackled softly in the fisherman's cottage as Sasha stared out the rain-streaked window. Jack poured a generous swig of Irish cream in his coffee, his jaw set, his eyes distant. The holidays were just around the corner, and Alaska was calling them back. But leaving now felt like walking away from something unfinished. We should be home by now. Snow, family, Christmas lights, normalcy. And yet, here we are, in the middle of nowhere, tangled up in something we don't even understand, he said, as he handed a cup to Sasha, who was curled up in a large chair by the fire. Sasha took a sip from her hot mug. Maybe it's not our fight. We could leave tomorrow, pretend none of this ever happened. Jack looked at her thoughtfully, his fingers tapping against his mug. The firelight flickered across his face, deepening the shadows in his furrowed brow. Yeah, he said finally, his voice slow, almost as though he were convincing himself. But something tells me we won't be able to forget this, even if we try. There's something about this place that seems to have a hold on me. I don't know if it's because of that wolf we saw, or if it's knowing that my ancestors came from here, but I can't seem to disentangle myself from this mystery we're caught up in. Sasha shifted uncomfortably, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. It sounds like you want to stay. Jack gave a humorless chuckle. After everything we've seen, that unholy ritual in the ruins and that thing that chased us makes me want to run like hell. He paused, the weight of their situation settling between them. The thing is, Sasha, every piece of logic I know is telling me to run, but another part of me wants to know what is really going on here. Sasha stared into her cup as the rain drummed softly on the roof. The fire popped, punctuating the silence. Outside, the wind picked up again, as though whispering something just out of earshot. Finally, she looked up at Jack, her eyes searching his face. We have a few more days on our rental. What do you say about taking a couple more days to dig around a bit, see what happens? But promise me one thing, Jack. The moment things turn too dangerous, we get the heck out of here. Jack gave a small nod. Deal. He glanced at the old clock on the mantel. Tomorrow we'll find someone who actually knows this island, someone who isn't afraid to tell us what we're dealing with. The wind howled once more, rattling the windows of the fisherman's cottage. The candle on the mantel sputtered and burned out, leaving the only light in the room coming from the stone fireplace. Jack reached for Sasha's hand. Let's get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll start fresh. The next morning broke with a gray, reluctant light. The storm had finally passed, leaving the island shrouded in mist. Jack and Sasha stood at the edge of the small village, their breath visible in the cold, damp air. The cottages seemed to hunch against the wind, their white stone walls weathered from the many storms. Gentle waves lapped up the stone retaining wall to the small cafe that sat overlooking the bay. The cobbled sidewalk was pitted and worn from the salt water washing over the stones during heavy storms. The cries of gulls pierced the air as they landed on the peaked roof, then flew away again. It was the first time since they'd arrived that they had seen a light on in the small cottage and an open sign in the window. A brass bell jingled as they pushed the heavy door open. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee combined with the earthy smell of peat smoke coming from the small wood stove in the corner of the room. A stout woman with wispy white hair stood behind the counter, her sharp eyes narrowing as they entered. "Morning," Jack greeted with a careful smile, glancing around at the shelves lined with local goods, jars of preserves, raw honey, hand-knit sweaters, and old books. "Sit wherever you'd like," the woman said as she came around the counter with a couple of menus. "Nice to see the rain letting up. Where you folks from?" Sasha smiled. "We're from the U.S., Alaska specifically. We're just here for a few days." "You be staying at the old fisherman's cottage?" the woman asked. Jack looked at her inquisitively, but the woman quickly added, "Oh, nothing much gets around these parts without everyone knowing your business." "How long have you lived here?" Sasha asked the woman. "Oh, nigh my whole life. I was born on Achill Island. My husband, God rest his soul, was a fisherman, and when he died, I bought this little place. It pays the bills." "I'm sorry about your husband," Sasha replied. "Oh, never mind that. Don't mean to spoil your morning. Now, what will you be having?" Jack and Sasha glanced over the menu and ordered eggs and rashers, also known as back bacon, and box tea, Irish potato pancakes. "Good choice," she smiled as she retreated to the kitchen to give the cook the order, returning quickly with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I know how you Americans like your coffee. Not us. We like a hearty black tea with plenty of cream," she replied as she set the cups down on the table. "Now tell me what brings you to my fair isle at this time of year." "We were hoping to learn a little bit of the history of this island," Jack responded. "I've got to say, though, I'm a bit surprised at how uncomfortable that seems to make people when we bring up the subject." The woman laughed, a deep, hearty chuckle that seemed to echo off the stone walls of the small cafe. "Surprised, are ya? Well, you wouldn't be if you lived here as long as I have." She leaned on the table, her hands planted firmly on the worn wood. "This island has a long history of secrets, and some of our community would just as soon keep it hidden." Sasha gave a quick glance to Jack, her brow furrowing. "We're not here trying to dig up trouble. We just keep stumbling into things we can't explain." The woman studied the two of them a long, uncomfortable moment, as if sizing them up and deciding how much she should tell them. She wiped her hands on her apron, then untied the straps and folded it over the back of an empty chair. "Well, it's a bit of a quiet morning," she said, as she pulled the empty chair up to Jack and Sasha's table. "What do you want to know about this little island of ours?" Jack smiled and stuck out his hand. "I'm Jack Moore, and my lovely companion here is Sasha." "Pleased to meet you both. My name is Fiona. My husband was Finn O'Shea, God rest his soul. He had a falling out with some of the townsfolk here, so they tend to keep their distance. During the winter, we don't get many tourists around these parts, so money is pretty tight this time of year. I'm not open many days anymore, only when the weather looks promising." "That explains why we always see a closed sign on your door when we're walking by," Sasha replied. Fiona smiled. "Well, I'm glad you stopped by today." "We've had some interesting interactions with the locals," Jack explained. Most have been not exactly friendly. Oh, no surprise, Fiona explained. We're a tight lot. Don't like much snooping around, if you know what I mean. Well, we really weren't snooping around, explained Sasha. We visited the ruins and the old cemetery, and we walked around the old boycott house. Just regular touristy stuff. Fiona gave them both a sharp look. I heard you were asking around about the Faoladh, and that's enough to set the locals on edge, you see. But why? Sasha asked. It's a part of the history of Ireland, the wolf warriors. Aye, but there are some things that are guarded very closely. Let me explain. Just then the bell above the door tinkled, and Fiona rose to greet the new customer. Jack looked at Sasha with an exasperated look, wondering if Fiona would be able to come back to her tale. They were relieved to hear the customer ordering coffee in to-go cups. Soon he was on his way, and Fiona came back to her chair at the table. Now it is known by some that the fairies of Ireland weren't much like the fairies we hear about in these latter days, wee little harmless things full of mischief and frolic. No, they were respected and often feared, for their anger was quick and their kindness was rare. Aye, some would join men in battle if it were to their own advantage, and others would make war on men. Many were omens of ill fortune, and it was a brave but foolish fellow who'd build his house on a fairy knoll. But of all the fairies in the world of the Sidhe, none were more feared than the Faoladh, or the Dark Man, he who lurks, he who stalks, the dark druid of the Sidhe. Not so much is told or even known about this fairy, for even to whisper his name was to invite his attention, and he was none too fond of people sharing his ways and habits. Tall he was, and narrow of frame, clad always in black or dark material, with a face you'd never quite see, for your eyes would slide away like a stumbling child on a frozen lake, and you'd be glad of it, for such waters could swallow you whole. As their years passed differently than our own, he's most often dressed in fashions a little out of date, but cut well and dapper for all that. He serves as the fairy queen's taker, as it was known. When she needed a mortal, he'd be the one sent to gather them. Whether child or elder made no odds to him. On his black horse he rode the highways and lanes of Ireland, going about his business with neither fear nor favour, and those he came for in the night were never heard from again. Jack looked perplexed. The day we arrived, I saw a dark figure, a man, standing on the cliffs overlooking Keem Bay. Later we saw the same man enter a pub we were at least I think it was the same man. Everyone turned and looked at him when he walked in the door, but he left as soon as he had whispered something to the barkeeper. And then a severed sheep's head was left on our doorstep, and that night we saw him again. He's always wearing a long dark cloak with a hood that covers most of his face. Fiona nodded her head. That'd be him, lad. Finding a sheep's head on your doorstep is not a good sign, not at all. That would be a warning to you from the Faoladh, the Dark Man himself. He'd be trying to scare you away, full moon coming and all. You didn't go traipsing into the ruins of the deserted village at night during the full moon, did you? God help you if you did. Jack glanced at Sasha, wondering if they should tell Fiona what they had witnessed. What is going on out there at night? He asked. Dark things, Fiona replied, her voice little more than a whisper, as though saying it aloud might summon them. She glanced toward the window, where the mist pressed thick against the glass, and crossed herself quickly. Jack leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Can you be a little more specific? Fiona shook her head, her hands busy with a rag she twisted nervously. This old village doesn't rest easy. It hasn't for generations. Folks here don't go out at night, at least not on a full moon, not ever. Sasha pressed, her voice steady but careful. But why? What is that thing they are summoning? Fiona's eyes grew wide. You did go out there, she exclaimed frantically. A shadow of something unreadable passed over her face. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. There are things that linger, things tied to the land, to the old ways. You can call it history or mythology. You might even call it a fairy tale. But the truth is, there is a dark thing that lies under Sleevemore Mountain, and there are those who will do anything they can to stop you from finding out about it. Jack and Sasha exchanged a look. Fiona's words felt heavy, as though they carried far more weight than she was willing to explain. You said, God help us if we did, Jack added. What exactly are we up against here? Fiona hesitated before replying, her gaze distant, as though she were recalling something she wished she could forget. If you stirred what shouldn't be stirred, it'll find you. It always does. A shiver ran down Sasha's spine, but she squared her shoulders. If you know something that can help us, please tell us. We're not looking to make things worse. We just need answers. We need to know what this thing is and how we can fight it. Jack looked at Fiona thoughtfully. What does this have to do with the wolf warriors? And why are we seeing wolves around here when they're supposedly gone from the island? Fiona's face paled at Jack's words, and her eyes grew wide. She set the rag down and folded her arms tightly across her chest, as though bracing herself against the question. The wolves aren't gone, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire in the wood stove. No, they've been here all along, watching, waiting. The wolf warriors. That's a story most folk would tell you died out with the old ways. But stories have roots, and roots go deep. Jack leaned forward. So you're saying the wolf warriors were real? And still exist? Fiona let out a slow breath, her eyes narrowing as she regarded them carefully. They were more than real. They were protectors once, bound to the land by blood and vow. It's said their spirits linger, tied to Sleevemore Mountain itself, guarding the darkness beneath it. She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. Sasha frowned. Are you saying the wolves we've seen, they're connected to this darkness? That they're, warning us? Or trying to protect us? Fiona didn't answer immediately, her gaze drifting to the window where the mist curled thick and heavy outside. Warnings come in many forms, lass. Wolves have always been messengers here, of death, of danger, of something old awakening. If you've seen them, then it's already begun. Jack's jaw clenched. What's begun? Fiona looked at him sharply, her voice dropping low. The unraveling. The mountain doesn't just hide darkness, it holds it. For centuries, that's been enough to keep the balance. But if someone's tried to wake it... She broke off, shaking her head as if to clear the thought. You'd best stop looking for answers, the both of you. Go home while you still can. Fiona's eyes softened, though her expression remained grim. Listen to me, this isn't your fight. The island has its own way of settling things. You're outsiders. You'll only make it worse. Jack stood straighter, his voice firm. Worse than a dark thing waking under a mountain? I think we're already past that point. Fiona exhaled sharply, picking up her rag again, as if trying to busy her hands. If you're set on this foolishness, go find Malachi O'Shea. He is my husband's brother. The man knows more than most, though he's been driven near mad from it. He lives alone up near the old cliffs, past Keem Bay. He'll tell you what you're so desperate to hear, but don't say I didn't warn you. The room fell silent, save for the faint wind rattling the windows. Jack met Sasha's eyes, and in that wordless exchange, they both knew there was no turning back. "Keem Bay, then," Jack said quietly. Fiona muttered something under her breath as they turned to leave. "God help you, indeed." As they stepped out into the mist once more, the world felt colder, the air heavier, as though the island itself was holding its breath. The howl of a distant wolf echoed across the hillside, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Jack and Sasha trudged up the narrow path that twisted along the cliffs above Keem Bay, looking for Malachi's stone house with the red door. It was easy to spot, the only house on the windswept cliff surrounded by grazing sheep. The wind whipped around them like a living thing while the sea rumbled below, waves crashing into the rocks with relentless fury. The gray sky pressed low, and the air carried the faint scent of salt and earth, cold, sharp, and foreboding. The small stone cottage was weather-beaten and crooked against the hillside. The thatched roof sagged in places, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. It looked as though it had been there for centuries, half forgotten and lost to time. Before Jack could knock, the door creaked open on its own. An eerie silence followed, broken only by the distant crash of the waves. Inside, a raspy voice called out, deep and gravelly, as though scraped over stones. "Come in, strangers. I've been expecting you." Jack and Sasha exchanged a wary glance, but stepped inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from a fire that crackled in the hearth. Shadows danced along the walls, clawing at the ceiling. In the corner of the room sat an old man with wild silver hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to glow faintly, even in the firelight. "You must be Malachi O'Shea," Jack said carefully. The man didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head slightly and studying them with an intensity that sent a shiver down Sasha's spine. His movements were unnervingly smooth, his gaze predatory, like a wolf sizing up its prey. I am," Malachi finally said, his voice a low rumble. "And you're the two fools who stirred up the ruins." Sasha stepped forward, her jaw tight. "We didn't mean to stir anything. We're just trying to understand what's happening here, what we saw." Malachi chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. "Saw something, did you? And what exactly did you see?" Jack hesitated before answering. "We saw a wolf, a massive one, bigger than any animal I've ever seen. It had glowing green eyes like yours." At this, Malachi's lips curled into a thin smile, revealing teeth that looked just a bit too sharp. The fire crackled loudly, sending up a spray of sparks, and for a heartbeat, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. "You've got keen eyes, boy," Malachi said softly, his gaze fixed unflinchingly on Jack. "Not everyone would see the truth for what it is." Sasha's voice was barely above a whisper. "It was you. You were the wolf at the ruins." Malachi stood then, unfolding himself from the chair with an unnerving grace. Though stooped with age, there was a primal power in the way he moved. "Aye," he said, his voice vibrating through the room. "I was there. I am the wolf." His presence seemed to fill the room. Jack took a step back, instinctively positioning himself between Malachi and Sasha. "What are you?" Malachi's green eyes glowed brighter, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the shadow of something ancient flickered across his features. "I am what's left of the old ways, the wolf warriors you've heard about. They weren't just stories. My kind were bound to this land, guardians of what lies beneath Sleevemore Mountain. He took a slow step toward them, his voice heavy with an ancient wariness. We were protectors once, but time twists everything. Now we are cursed to walk both worlds, man and beast, torn between what was and what is. Sasha swallowed hard, her mind racing. And the darkness, the thing beneath the mountain, what is it? Why are people trying to wake it? Malachi stopped, his expression darkening. Because some fools believe they can control it, that they can use it. But there are things in this world that should never be woken. What sleeps under the mountain? It's older than man, older than wolves. And if it wakes fully, this island will burn along with everyone on it. Jack's fists clenched at his sides. Then help us stop it. Tell us what we need to do. Malachi stared at him for a long moment before letting out a low, guttural laugh that sounded more like a growl. You think you can stop it? Outsiders, wandering where you don't belong? His smile faded, and his voice dropped to a growl. No, this is no fight for you. The wolves will see to it. The fire flared suddenly, its glow casting an ominous light across Malachi's face. For a split second, Jack swore he saw the shadow of a wolf behind him, massive and hulking, its eyes blazing green. Jack took a steadying breath as he stood his ground, his gaze locked on Malachi. The fire in the hearth hissed and popped, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Maybe you're right, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. This isn't a fight for outsiders, but the thing is, we're not outsiders. Malachi's glowing green eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. What nonsense are you spouting, boy? Sasha looked at Jack, unsure what he was about to say. Jack gave her a small, reassuring nod before turning back to Malachi. We're like you, Malachi, Jack said quietly. Sasha and I, we're wolves too. For a long moment the room was utterly silent, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Then Malachi let out a low, guttural laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, you think you can fool me? He sneered, his voice full of contempt. You don't know what you're saying, lad. There's more to being a wolf than some romantic notion of blood and bone. Jack's jaw tightened, his patience thinning. I know exactly what I'm saying. And then, before Sasha could stop him, Jack took a step forward, his shoulders rolling back as he allowed the shift to begin. It wasn't much, just a subtle change, but it was enough. His eyes darkened and then glowed faintly gold, the unmistakable glint of a wolf's gaze. His teeth sharpened ever so slightly, a flash of something feral peeking through. Malachi froze. The mocking smile vanished from his face, replaced by something that looked like disbelief. He stepped closer, his green eyes flicking to Sasha. She hesitated, then sighed. Fine. With a subtle flex of her shoulders, Sasha let her own shift ripple through her. Her blue eyes flared gold, her breath fogging slightly in the cold room, as though the air itself could sense the primal energy in her veins. Malachi stared at them both, unblinking. His face was a mask of wariness, but Jack saw the flicker of recognition, the understanding that could only come from one who carried the same burden. Well, I'll be damned, Malachi muttered under his breath. He ran a weathered hand through his wild silver hair, his gaze never leaving theirs. I didn't think there were any others left. The wolves of the old blood. We're supposed to be gone. Scattered to the wind. How? Jack let the shift fade, his eyes returning to their human form. "It's a long story," he said, "and we're still learning the truth of it ourselves. But we're here now, and we're not turning our backs on this fight." Sasha stepped closer to Jack. "Whatever's under that mountain, it's not just your problem. If it threatens this land, it threatens all of us. Wolves protect what's theirs." Malachi's gaze softened, though his face remained grim. "You don't understand what you're walking into," he said, his voice a little quieter now. "This darkness, this thing, is older than the wolves, older than the mountain itself. My pack couldn't stop it, and they're nearly all gone now. What makes you think you can?" Jack's voice was steady when he replied, "Because we're not going to fight it alone. We've learned the hard way that wolves are stronger in a pack, but from where I'm standing, you've been fighting alone for far too long." Malachi looked at him sharply, his eyes searching Jack's face for some hidden truth. For a moment, Jack thought the old man would scoff, tell them to leave, to let the island devour itself. Instead, Malachi let out a long breath, shoulders slumping as though some of the weight he carried had finally eased. "You're a couple of stubborn fools," he muttered, though there was no real anger in his voice. "But maybe that's exactly what this place needs." He turned back to the fire, staring into the flames as though searching for answers in the embers. "You've seen the wolves," he said, his voice distant. "You've seen me. But there are others, men who've given themselves over to the darkness. They'll try to stop you. They'll try to break you. If you're serious about this fight, you'll need more than sharp teeth and glowing eyes." Jack and Sasha exchanged a look, their determination unshaken. "Then tell us what we need to do," Sasha said. "Tell us how to fight this evil that's lurking in that mountain." Malachi turned back to them, his glowing green eyes sharp as ever. "The wolves of this island are waking," he said, "and so is the thing they were meant to guard. You're right about one thing. You won't be fighting this alone." The fire crackled again, casting shadows across Malachi's face. "The old ways are calling to us. If you're ready to answer, then I'll show you where to begin." Outside, a wolf's howl rose through the mist, long and mournful. Jack felt the sound resonate deep in his chest, a call to something ancient, something waiting. Sasha tightened her grip on Jack's arm. "Looks like we're in this now." Jack nodded, his gaze hard. "All the way." As Jack and Sasha left the cottage and stepped into the biting wind, they could still feel Malachi's eyes on them, burning like embers in the dark. The howl of a wolf echoed from somewhere up on the cliffs, long and mournful, and as they looked up, Jack swore he saw a massive shape moving through the mist, watching them. Sasha pulled her raincoat tighter around her shoulders. "It's nice to know we're not alone out here, Jack." "It is," Jack said quietly, his gaze fixed on the cliffs. "It is." As they walked back to their rental car in the parking lot at Keem Bay, Jack felt something stirring inside, a pull, a need to gather strength from the one thing that had always kept them steady: family. "We're going to need them," Jack said softly, letting his words drift on the wind. He stopped and pulled Sasha close. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The whole pack. Grizzly, Miguel, Julian, Kat, all of them. Sasha stared at him for a moment, surprised, before her expression softened. "Christmas in Ireland," she murmured, a touch of warmth breaking through the somber mood. "They'll think we're out of our minds." "Maybe we are," Jack admitted. "Maybe we are." Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for the next installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful week. We'll see you all next week.